All right, let's get started. First of all, welcome to Weizenbaum-Institut. It's great to see so many familiar new faces. My name is Nicholas. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at TU Berlin and also an associated researcher at Weizenbaum. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our fantastic speakers and our moderators as well. And just maybe 2 words on Weizenbaum. So the Weizenbaum-Institut is it's a research institute bringing together a range of universities, conducting basic interdisciplinary research on all facets of network societies, from chatbots to digital well-being. And today we want to bring together 2 highly influential policy debates. We want to talk about sustainability, but we also want to talk about digitalization. And more specifically, we want to zoom in on the notion of sustainable AI. And I guess in many ways this event today concludes a year-long project, a short project as it was called, which examined the co-productionist relationship between digitalization and sustainability. Just on Tuesday we held a workshop with experts from both policy and academia, and we explored the notion of informational sustainability and sort of looked at exploring new ways of looking at existing relationships between data, information, and sustainability. And this afternoon, we want to open up the debate to the broader public. And as the title already suggests, talk about AI, the narratives that are driving it, but most importantly, also think about the impacts that AI, in the context of sustainability, might or might not actually have. When it comes to today's event, we've got 2 great talks. Paul Schütze will join us first, then we'll have a very brief Q&A afterwards. This brief Q&A really is brief, so the idea is really to focus on clarification questions. So if there's anything on your mind that you want to know immediately, just give it a shot. Afterwards, we'll have Marx talking. And then we again have a brief Q&A, and then afterwards we'll have a panel discussion. So there's plenty of room and plenty of time to ask all your questions and comments and so on and so forth. There will be a few words on admin. There will be a public stream on the 2 talks and the immediate Q&As afterwards. This recording will be made publicly available afterwards. The panel itself will not be streamed and not recorded, just so you know. But let's get started with our 2 talks. So this afternoon we sort of engage with this somewhat provocative research question: can artificial intelligence really help save the planet, or is it just another resource-hungry illusion? Right? I mean, so engaging with this somewhat provocative question, we have 2 fantastic speakers here. First up, we have Paul Schütze. Paul is a research assistant in the Ethics and Critical Theories of AI research group at the University of Osnabrück. In his current research, he is interested in the societal impacts and ethical challenges, digital technologies, as well as in the social philosophy of the climate crisis. And he pays particular attention to how AI technologies are structurally connected to the climate crisis. Our second speaker is Marx. Paris is a tech critic, author, podcaster, and international speaker, commenting on the intersections of technology, politics, and the future. He hosts the award-winning podcast Tech Won't Save Us, the System Crash podcast, and he also writes the Disconnect newsletter. And his work has been published, as you may know, around the world in media such as Time, Wired, NBC News, and MIT Technology Review. It's been translated into a dozen languages, and his first book, Road to Nowhere, was published in 2022. So once again, Paris and Paul, it's great to have you here today. Last but not least, I want to introduce the 2 moderators of the panel. And these are our very own Jana Panier and Rainer Rehag. Jana is a doctoral researcher at the Weizenbaum-Institut and also at the WZB, Berlin Social Science Center. Her research centers on the social dynamics of the development and use of AI-based systems in context of critical infrastructures and on changes in knowledge practices through digital technologies. Rainer is a doctoral researcher also here at Weizenbaum-Institut and also an associated researcher at WZB, Berlin Social Science Center. Amongst others, his research interests include technology impact assessment, collective data protection, systemic IT security, state hacking, and the implications and limits of AI systems. So without further ado, I would ask you to join me in welcoming Paul to the stage.
All right. Yeah, hi. Nice to see so many of you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the invite. Yeah, I'm Paul, and today I'm going to speak about the problem of sustainable AI. So my goal will be essentially to convince you that maybe AI is not such a good idea if it comes to sustainability. Right, and without further ado, let's get into it. I thought, since we're talking about sustainability, I thought it makes much sense to present the current climate conditions, right? So this is the background against which we all discuss these topics. So I thought it makes sense to just bring some of the latest climate news, right? So apparently we have reached the 1.5 degrees warming goal already last year. Forests are burning at an unprecedented rate, and for those based in Europe, we are witnessing a drought at the beginning of this year, and so things are not looking good, right? And so I just want to mention this here in this context because I think it's very important that this marks the background against which we discuss these technological ideas and applications, right? I think this kind of bases this maybe sometimes lofty discussion in reality. So that's why I brought this here. Right, so but now regarding sustainable AI. So what I want to argue is that sustainable AI is a symptom of a very specific socioeconomic condition, right? So this means that sustainable AI results from a very concrete cultural horizon, and only from within this horizon it makes sense and it can be understood, right? So this is the first thing I want to argue. Then I want to say that sustainable AI is essentially a techno fix for what should be societal and political problems or discussions. So that means that sustainable AI shifts attention away from other areas which I think should much more discuss. And lastly, I want to argue that sustainable AI reinforces existing structures of exploitation, right? So it just is a technology that keeps business as usual going and does not do too much towards a better future. So this is essentially what I'm going to try to convince you of. And so this is the main argument, or these are the main arguments, right? But before, I just want to spend some time, quickly go through this. What are we actually talking about? So get everyone on the same page, right? So what is sustainable AI all about? What's happening there? So first I just want to talk about the hype quickly, right? So there are big companies. So we have the sustainable AI hype in the economy. So companies such as Google or also Microsoft are pushing for using AI in regards to sustainability. They claim that AI might help reach some sustainability goals, reduce emissions, all that, right? So we have this in the industry, but we also have this in academia. So we have research regarding how AI can be used to achieve sustainable development goals, for instance. But we also have this in regards to policy. So we have politicians and policymakers picking this up, right? So this is essentially the hype that's created around sustainable AI. Right, so now that we all know what's roughly going on there, I want to quickly spend some time on a theoretical basis, so to say. So there's been in academia this very influential paper regarding what is sustainable AI all about. So there's this notion of using AI for sustainability and the notion of the sustainability of AI, right? So these are two different things. And so AI for sustainability is just very simple, right? It's using AI for sustainable development goals. So using concrete applications to reach certain goals. Yeah, you can see these examples there. And regarding the sustainability of AI, it's very simple as well, right? So how sustainable are certain applications? And we have some examples here. So data centers, for instance, use a lot of water. I think we will hear much more about this later. And interestingly, there's also this implicit thing in there that AI can also be used to further unsustainable goals, right? So for instance, Microsoft has partnered with fossil fuel companies and sold AI to them, or AI applications. And so there's also this side of the sustainability of AI, right? So this just to give a rough, maybe conceptual idea, and yeah. However, if you talk about AI, it's not at all clear what AI is, right? So we should also spend some time on discussing, okay, what are we actually talking about when we say AI? And so I just want to quickly present some maybe conceptual clarity here. So first, there's this very simple view of AI as technology, right? So what does this mean? It's a very common view in the public, but also an academic discourse which just looks at very concrete AI applications. So, for instance, we just look at social media algorithms, ChatGPT, image processing systems, and this comes with an instrumentalist view, right? So this assumes that maybe these technologies are neutral, it depends on how they are used. Are they used for good or bad? And so this also implies that they can be used for good or bad. And so this assumes that technology is merely a neutral tool, right? And so this is the view of viewing AI as a technology, right? But of course, as we all know, I guess, this is not the whole story, but there's also this part of AI beyond technology, right? So everything that lies beyond these mere superficial applications. So this view posits that AI and society are essentially intertwined. I think you all know this. Technology is not at all neutral, right? So it's not a neutral tool. We can't just use it for good or bad, whatever we like. And AI is inherently entangled in social material networks, right? So it depends on supply chains, on data centers, on energy, infrastructures, mining, and all of that, human labor, right? So this all essentially is the network of AI, right? And so this view can, for instance, be found in the book by Benedetta Brevini, Is AI Good for the Planet? Or by works focusing on digital labor, right? So you can find this view in a lot of academic, especially critical discourse, right? Okay, and so after knowing this beyond technology discourse, we could stop and ask, well, okay, how sustainable is AI, right? So we now know that there's much more to AI than just a simple technology. And so we could stop here and say, okay, if we look at this beyond technology perspective, how sustainable is it? And so I would say, well, okay, if we stop here, things don't look so good, right? So we have the energy consumption, we have the resource use, we also have the data centers I mentioned in the beginning, and their water footprint. And so if we stop here, we can already say, well, okay, it doesn't look so good for AI. And I think Paris is going to present this in much more clarity than I am here. And so I think this is already a good learning up until this point. However, what I want to focus and spend the majority of time today on is what lies beyond the environmental impact, right? So I would argue that AI has an ideological impact in a sense that even if we could get rid of the environmental impact of AI, sustainable AI would still not be such a good idea. And so this is the argument I'm making. And so this is based on a view of AI as ideology, right? So looking at AI in terms of ideology means what I said in the very beginning, that it's a technology that comes from a very specific cultural horizon, right? So if we go into materialist thinking that comes from philosophy of technology, we find that technologies only make sense from a very specific outset, so to say, right? So they are developed out of a certain society, out of certain structures, and only from this viewpoint do they make sense, right? So only if you are within this structure does this technology make sense. And so I think a good example here is, for instance, electric cars, right? So they're posited as a sustainable solution, but they only make sense from within a society which is focused on individual mobility and certain other things, right? So we could also talk about public transport much more, or bike lanes and all that, right? And so I think this is a good example and a good analogy which might make clear what this cultural horizon means. And so this is also based on shared societal visions of the future, right? So what we as a society deem to be a good future where we want to move together towards, right? And so if you remember these examples I gave in the beginning, I think that it becomes pretty clear that there's a certain picture, a certain vision society is currently moving towards, right? So it seems to be that there's a hegemonic or dominant idea of where we move, and so this tells us something about how sustainable AI should be used or how it makes sense only, right? And so, for instance, some of the values embedded in this are the values of efficiency and objectivity, of control and progress. And I think it's important to realize here that these are not neutral values, but they're just contingent, right? So they come from this very specific cultural horizon, and things also could be otherwise. So these must not be the values, but there could be other values, for instance. Right, and of course, as I said already, this is deeply entangled with hegemonic interests by big tech and power dynamics also currently being pushed by big tech companies or the billionaires at the top of these companies, right? And so I think, what does this mean? I think the important thing to realize here is that sustainable AI is an idea which comes from this very specific horizon, right? From this very specific idea of efficiency, objectivity, and so on, right? And so what I want to do now is spend some time on presenting this cultural horizon, kind of sketch it a little bit, and I think we can maybe talk about this later in more detail if you want. But if we zoom in closer on what are we actually talking about in regards to the cultural horizon sustainable AI is coming from, there's this great book by Stefania Barker called The Forces of Reproduction, and it's focused on building a counter-hegemony, but in the very beginning, she introduces the idea that current hegemonic narratives are stemming from capitalist industrial modernity, right? So what does this mean? It means that Western science and industrial technology is often seen as the essential or the key driver of human progress and well-being, right? So we have kind of accepted that pushing forward innovation will further all of our well-being, right? So this kind of goes in line with a linear idea of progress, and so things will always become better, right? So this is, for instance, one bracket of the cultural horizon here. Right. Other examples of this, and I'm sure you have heard of this, is, for instance, techno-solutionism and the promise of superintelligence, which is very often voiced in regards to AI, right? So there's this famous book by Morozov called To Save Everything, Click Here. I think this is one very famous book where the idea of techno-solutionism was introduced. And I think the title says everything, essentially. So it's the idea that technology can solve all of our problems, or at least many of our societal problems, right? And so techno-solutionism is tightly linked to this idea of or to the capitalist industrial modernity, right? So it plays a key role in also advancing this socioeconomic system. And regarding the promise of superintelligence, we, for instance, have an interview by Zach Cass, apparently an ex-manager at OpenAI, and I think the interview was 1.5 years ago or something, and there are two interesting things in there. So there's the idea that many of the tech elite believe in the emergence of fusion reactors, right? So eventually we will have unlimited energy. And I think the second part is even more interesting. So he argues that if you ask ChatGPT how we can capture CO2, we find really good answers, right? So in there lies the idea that there can be a super intelligence which might tell us things we humans cannot yet solve, realize, imagine, and in virtue of this we can solve the climate crisis and build a sustainable, better world, right? But there's also other people which you might expect it less of, such as Bill Gates, right? A very, very famous philanthropist who's apparently doing good, and he argues that he argues that big tech companies will be the ones driving innovation, right? So they will develop green energy grids and accelerate all this, and so because they spend so much money there, we'll eventually have green energy, right? So this is the argument, very much techno-solutionist argument, and more recently we can see these arguments also in regards to AI, where the Donald Trump administration is trying to ban federal states from regulating AI for 10 years. So in a bill, they want to prohibit the federal states of further introducing AI regulations. And so I think this shows the deep-seated belief in the power or the potential of innovation as a solution, right? And of course, I haven't even talked about Elon Musk and the whole connection there. But yeah, you could go, I think, on and on and on. And so there's this great paper called the Test-Grill Bundle, which I think unravels the ideologies surrounding current AI developments very nicely. And for instance, one of the ideologies is transhumanism, essentially the belief that technology will build a better than human species, so we can pass our biological limitations and maybe eventually even colonize space, move into space, and have a better future with lots of potential, right? And so here Elon Musk comes back in because he's a believer of, or like a follower of transhumanism. And so we see that even though this might not be an influential ideology in a very public or like mainstream sense, we see very powerful actors pushing this. And in virtue of these powerful actors, this kind of seeps into the very core of capitalist society, right? And so this kind of gives you maybe a good idea of what the cultural horizon looks like, right? So this is let's say the arena where the idea of sustainable AI came about, right? Or in which it is situated, and which we always have to think about when we talk about sustainable AI, right? And so I've brought an example, so it gets a little bit more, let's say, practical, right? So we can get an idea of what does this mean. So how's this cultural horizon influencing the societal discourse? And so there's this paper by Orrit Halpern called Planetary Intelligence. And in this paper, Orrit Halpern visits the Atacama Desert in Chile, and visits I think it's lithium mines there, and so Orrit Halpern writes about the devastation these mines leave there, and so how the landscapes are transformed, etc., etc., which in itself is like a whole big issue. And I think what is very interesting in regards to this is that soon in the desert the water will run out and the ore will get depleted, and so the resources are slowly dwindling, and we are kind of seeing the end of the resources, right? And so with the help of AI and machine learning, the extraction is now moving from pure extraction to optimization, right? To optimizing the mining. So ever more minuscule sensors are put into place, and here you can see a picture, I think it's taken at a university, where machine learning algorithms are used to predict where even the last bits of ore are and how certain water usages can be recycled. And so how essentially the idea is that resources can then be stretched almost into infinity, right? So with the help of AI, we can now find ever more tiny amounts of ore, and so the end of resources we can see, it moves into the distant future, right? And so the appearance is that the resources can be infinitely stretched. And even more interesting is the belief that when these resources on Earth are gone, we can move into space and start asteroid mining, right? And I think in the paper she writes, this is not at all a distant idea, but companies such as Goldman Sachs, I think it was, actually did reports on this and calculated how much it would cost to mine an asteroid. So it's not like a lofty example, right? But it's actually being done, and people think about this. And so I think what this shows is that Earth is no longer the limit in this sense. And this resembles what I presented before regarding the transhumanist ideals, right? So if Earth limits us, we can move into space and transcend our earthly boundaries, so to say, right? And okay, thank you. And so I think this gives you maybe a concrete example of how the cultural horizon gives rise to the idea of sustainable AI, and then how in turn this is used and practically applied. And so I think it's important to realize here what this does, so what are the effects of this. And so in virtue of such examples, I would argue the urgency of the climate crisis in the now, so that the conditions I presented at the very beginning, right? So they are pushed to the back because it appears as if we can always move further with the help of technology, right? So the resources are stretched, and the end is being pushed into the future, right? And so this, on the one hand, obscures the urgency, and on the other hand, makes us believe that we can still solve the climate crisis, even if it becomes dire, right? And so this also ties in, for instance, into ideas of geoengineering or carbon capture and storage, which are actually now part of I think the latest IPCC report includes carbon capture and storage as a very real part of future policies, because without it we can't actually achieve the goals anymore. We need to stop even more extreme global warming, right? So you see the connections there, and you see the kind of the socioeconomic system all these things come from, right? And so another point here, another dimension is, I think, the myth of capitalist control, right? So what the example before nicely showed is that with the help of AI, or sustainable AI, if you will, we can still believe that we are in control, right? So we are in control of extracting these resources. We can optimize, and we are still the agents, so to say, right? So this is the illusion or the myth that is given by sustainable AI. And there's this book by Anat Singh, The Mushroom at the End of the World. And there she writes in the very beginning that capitalism so far in the West had always provided these stories of progress and innovation. So what I in the beginning mentioned as the idea of linear progress, we will always move towards a better future. And now with the climate crisis opening up, these stories kind of fade, or they fall apart, right? And so she says, well, okay, capitalism had provided the handrails we could all hold on to and we could feel secure, and so these stories would give us security. But without these stories, she says, the world has become a terrifying place, right? It's very difficult. The future doesn't look so bright anymore. Where do we go from here? And so what I would argue, the allure of sustainable AI is to provide these handrails again, right? To kind of make it appear as if these handrails are still there, so we can still lean on the technologies and we are still in control, and the story of progress and maybe of better well-being in the future still holds, right? And so I think this is a very, very good example here in the book. And yet another idea to maybe draw an analogy, which I very much like, and which I think is a very good analogy, comes from the book Under a White Sky, written by Elizabeth Colbert, and there she writes about maybe the history or certain frontiers where climate change or where the use or the control of nature can be seen, right? And so one example and I'm trying to go over this briefly, so I'm not an expert in all of this, but I think it's just a nice metaphor. One example is the fish species of Asian carp, right? And so in Chicago, I think it's in the 19th century or something, the Chicago River was modified, right? It was terraformed, and you can see it on the very bottom there. So the direction of the river was changed because sewage water from the city of Chicago was flowing into, I think it's Lake Michigan, and so they didn't want that anymore, and so they changed the direction of the river. And with this, they connected, I think, two major water landscapes. And so in another area, the species of Asian carp was introduced to do some ecological good, but then it turned out it's a very invasive species, and it's actually not very good. It's not doing much good, but it's taking over ecosystems and destroying the ecosystems. And now it turned out that by reversing the river, the carp had a way to move into Lake Michigan and thereby into the area of the Great Lakes, and so it's threatening to destroy the ecosystem of the Great Lakes, right? So the nature was basically terraformed, was transformed by humans, so it's basically the control of nature. And now this turns out to be a problem. And what they did then, and you can see this like a very tiny dot there, they put an electric barrier in the fence, in the river, right? So electric fence in the river, so the carp can't move up, right? So this is basically electrifying the river so the carp can't destroy the ecosystem, right? And so she says, well, if our control of nature fails, the solution surely must be more control, right? And she calls this the control of nature, right? So first you reverse the river, and then you have to electrify it. And so I think the analogy here is that sustainable AI functions in a similar way, right? So we are exploiting and controlling nature, and now this, as we all know, is kind of failing, and so we need more control. So sustainable AI in this analogy functions as the electric fence, right? So now we have to electrify the river again. And so I think this analogy nicely shows the perverse or maybe paradox idea of sustainable AI, or of using AI for sustainability. Right. Since this has mainly been critique, right, and so I hope I showed that sustainable AI might not be such a good idea after all. I think always the question comes up, okay, what can we do, right? So how to move forward? And I think this is not an easy at all question to answer. However, there are obviously some people who think about this, and I've just brought an example. I think we can maybe talk about this later also, if you want. And so the example comes from the feminist tech principles developed by the Super Lab, I think a think tank based here in Berlin. And so they posit these examples, these principles. I think it's 12. I'm not entirely sure, and I've just mentioned the first one here. And so the important thing here, I think they provide is they present a principle by which you can make the cultural horizon of the technology you are maybe wanting to produce, how you can make this cultural horizon visible, right? So before developing a technology, you should ask yourself, what are we optimizing for, right? So where does this come from? This idea of creating the technology, right? And so I think if we, for instance, ask ourselves this in the case of sustainable AI, it becomes pretty clear, right? We are optimizing for a system of efficiency, control, et cetera, right? And then there are other questions such as whose version of the future are we building? And I think we can all imagine that too. Whose imaginations are this, and what knowledge is this based on? And so I think this is a very good example of how one can move forward by implementing these principles, both personally, but maybe also on a policy level. But I think this just gives you a hint of maybe the more fundamental societal changes this would include. Right. So I hope I could give this spin, the critique a spin of positivity, of a good outlook in the end. I'm not entirely sure. However, with this, I'm at the end already, and I want to thank you for listening, and I'm excited to hear some questions, maybe. Yeah, thank you.
We have 5 minutes for clarifying questions, comments. Are there any?
Thanks very much for the presentation. I thought it was really helpful, particularly how you laid out the terms and the kind of embedded ideology in this talk around AI. I wondered what your thoughts were on perhaps the idea of public AI as opposed to sustainable AI as a means of sort of a next step in what we can do, sort of public actors that can embed public values, public interest in the development and in the stacks of AI systems.
Yeah, so I think it might sound like a good idea, and might also be a good way forward. I think, however, the argument I'm trying to make is that before thinking about such things, I think there should be a prior step, which is kind of thinking about the cultural horizon, as I took it from philosophy of technology, right? So true, maybe public AI then would also come with a more fundamental shift, right? And so then if this would happen, if so these more fundamental changes would happen, which I think is far from becoming reality right now, but then this might be a good idea, but only when being accompanied by this more fundamental, also systemic policy transition, yeah.
Hey there. So I know we talked about kind of the needing to change the cultural horizon, and I know that there's a really, really powerful narrative out there of techno-solutionism. Do you have any ideas for how can we challenge this narrative of techno-solutionism and kind of make this cultural horizon more visible to ordinary people? Or I say ordinary people, sorry, bad language, but visible to people who might not understand this paradigm.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, right? So it's the question of what to do, and I think it's a very hard question, and I've only started thinking about this myself. So how to make it more visible? I think it's just getting people aware. I don't know. Work such as Paris is doing, things like that, but also maybe in academia being more open towards going towards the public. But I don't have like a concrete answer to this. I must say, because as you said, right? So the hegemony or the dominant narratives are so powerful right now. So I think it's kind of maybe building more grassroots counter narratives. But yeah, if this is at all happening, I'm unsure myself, I must say.
One more question.
Thank you for the presentation. So my question is on, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So my question is about the catching up, right? So when you talked about the powerful few and hegemonic interests, and that's coming mostly from the north, global north, and the majority world is basically grappling with how to catch up with AI rather than thinking about what are the negative effects of it. So now how do we resolve this tension between the catching up and the negative effects? So because they don't have resources to basically to understand this to kind of resolve this, right? So that's my question.
Yeah, great. Thank you for bringing this up. I actually meant to say in the very beginning, but I forgot that. Of course, also the critique I'm presenting here is coming from my perspective, from working within German academia, and from also maybe critiquing the narratives, especially present in the Anglophone discourse. And so from other perspectives, other dimensions of critique might very well become visible as well. So I think this is a very important addition to add. And so with these other maybe dimensions of critique, also other solutions would become visible. And so how to resolve the tension you mentioned, I have actually no idea. So I'm like, I think that it's complex enough in the sense that like trying to get one's head around how these narratives are spun and how also deeply rooted they are. And so how now to bring in this power asymmetry in a solution, I think is a very complex task and which probably needs a lot more attention. Yeah, but yeah, I've thought about it, but I really have no solution to this. But thanks for bringing this up. Yeah.
Next up, we have Paris. So please.
Perfect, here we go. It's great to be here. I think my presentation will be pretty complementary with Paul's, getting us started, and then I'll take us in a slightly different direction, but very much in line as well, Very happy to be here in Berlin at the Weizenbaum-Institut. I was thinking, just while I was sitting down that a couple of years ago, someone got in contact and was like, hey, we're looking to try to get Computer Power and Human Reason republished or re-released in English because of everything that was going on. And I never got an update on that. I need to check in now that I'm thinking about it. But yeah, so we're going to dig into a bit more of the kind of perspective on sustainable AI, looking at those environmental impacts, but also looking at some bigger picture things as well. But not so much the bigger picture things Paul was talking about. So, it gives us two different perspectives on that, which is great. So let's start with this guy here. This is Microsoft President Brad Smith. I don't know, maybe he's familiar to you, maybe not. So in 2020, Microsoft announced this great carbon moonshot that it was embarking on, where it wanted to be carbon negative by 2030, right? Not even just carbon neutral, but negative, actually kind of eliminating the emissions of the Microsoft business. Then we know some things happened in the past little while that might have affected that goal. Microsoft released an update last year that its emissions were up 29% since 2020, rather than heading toward that negative goal. And so in an interview with Bloomberg, he said, that when they made that pledge, that was before the explosion in artificial intelligence. So in many ways, the moon, because they had set this moonshot, is now 5 times as far away, which is just so great. The moon has moved so far away; it's so much more difficult to reach because they just need to pursue AI and to use all of this electricity, which is creating all of these emissions. So you can see how really committed they are to these climate goals. But don't worry, I'm sure AI will just fix all of this in a few years, right, when it becomes super intelligent. And so, where did this all come from? I'm sure I don't really need to explain it to all of you, but, obviously in December of 2022, we have the release of ChatGPT, which starts to get people really excited about this next wave of what the tech industry is up to, right? The crypto boom has very much trailed off by this point. The industry is looking for something else. Interest rates are rising. What is going to fuel investment? Generative AI and chatbots becomes the next thing, right? Sam Altman gets really excited because so many people are signing up for ChatGPT, are using these new chatbots. It proves that this is the future in his mind. And the media starts to report on this and is asking, how can it change the world? What is actually going to happen here? How amazing is this? But also, should we be a bit fearful? Is there a bigger story here at play? Is the AGI a big risk to us? All very helpful things for an industry that's trying to make us believe that these technologies are so powerful and going to change everything. But what ultimately made that possible, right? What made it possible for generative AI to be the thing in that moment? I would say it's, kind of three main factors, right? First of all is this massive degree of centralized computation that these companies have put together, in particular since the founding of AWS, Amazon Web Services, back in 2006. And then, of course, Microsoft, Oracle, Google all jump on that bandwagon, some other companies as well. And so, they have these massive data centers stuffed full of servers that allow the training of larger and larger AI models. But on top of that, they also needed data, right? And so these companies went out and scraped as much as they could from the web to put into these models to train, using more data, using more computation, resulting in models that are more capable of things that they wouldn't have been capable of in the past. And then all of that requires massive amounts of capital, right, to build out these infrastructures, to gather all of this data. So that is kind of like what leads us to the moment where generative AI and where chatbots become the next big thing, is the creation of these infrastructures, right? It's not this big, massive breakthrough. It's the continual evolution of this business model over time, the creation of more centralized computation, the gathering of more data, the consolidation of more capital leading to this result. And of course, these are some of the infrastructures that come out of that, right? These major hyperscale data centers being built out by these companies that are, massive facilities. We're increasingly seeing pushback to. We can talk about that. In many different parts of the world. Obviously, the United States has the bulk of them. It often has about half of the hyperscale data centers in the world, but we're seeing the numbers grow in other parts of the world as well. Not just Europe, of course, but China too. And these companies are building them in more and more different places. Often a hyperscale data center, the terminology is, I think, a bit actually dated at the moment. If you look up like the definitions of what a hyperscale data center is, they'll often tell you it's over 10,000 square feet or 900 square meters, which is like very small, for the data centers they're building today. Holding more than 5,000 servers, an average Microsoft hyperscale data center now is 50,000 servers. So, you can see these definitions were made at a bit of a different time than the one that we're in right now. And just so you know what you're looking at here, it's Meta here up in the top next to an Amazon data center. These ones are both in the United States. Down here is Amazon in Virginia as well, and this is a Microsoft one in the Netherlands. So these massive facilities that are bringing this all together. And so it's hard to kind of really picture this, right? These hyperscale data centers, as they've been growing over the past number of years. In 2018, around the world, there were 430 hyperscale data centers, according to Synergy Research, which has been tracking this, right? Which seems like, that's not a whole lot of facilities if you think of like the entire world, but it's the kind of energy demands that they make, the scale that they exist on, where this really comes from. By 2020, that's up to 597 globally. And of course, near the end of 2024, we're up to 1,136, with another 504 either planned or in various stages of construction. And so we've seen this kind of massive ramp up as we have entered this moment of generative AI hype, excitement, these companies feeling that they need to build out all of this additional computation in order to fuel this bubble and this boom that they have been seeing. And so, over the past couple of years, we have seen all of these massive investments around the world in so many different parts of the world, multi-billion-dollar investments to build out major new data centers in so many different areas, from everywhere from Saudi Arabia and Japan to Indonesia, all over the place, right? These companies are trying to expand the footprint that they have to the degree that hyperscale data center capacity in 2023 was predicted to triple over 6 years. And we're certainly seeing this massive escalation going right now. But as these infrastructures have expanded, we have also seen the pushback expand as well in many different parts of the world. These infrastructures are built, they have these massive resource demands, communities are feeling the effects of that, people are not really loving it, right? They're also seeing the broader impacts that these tech companies are having on their societies and, maybe don't want to allow them to do whatever they want in their backyards. And so, these are protests in Ireland, in the Netherlands, in different parts of the United States, focusing on different issues that are relevant to their communities, to their societies, for why they don't really want to move forward with these types of infrastructures. And there are are many reasons for this, right? Different communities, you know, have issues with these infrastructures for different reasons. And so when we look at the water use on average, and this is an average for Google data centers, we see daily water use of 2.1 million liters. Annually, that's 760 million liters going to power one of these hyperscale data centers. Of course, that increases as the scale and the size continues to grow. We saw Google's water use increase by 20% in 2022. They have not been very open on sharing further numbers on that since, you know, since this whole generative AI boom started. For Microsoft, that was up 34% in 2022 as well. You know, not very open on giving us new numbers on that as well. And kind of what we're seeing is around the world, data centers are, you know, one of the areas of expansion are more desertic areas around the world. So part of the reason for this is that often there's more renewable energy there, so it looks better if they're trying to present themselves as greener. Sometimes energy can be cheaper in those sorts of regions, so they're making this kind of play for image and also for reduced cost, but you know, these infrastructures still require a lot of water, and that becomes very difficult in a place that doesn't have a lot of it, right? And so you're seeing in places like Spain or Arizona in the United States, where there's a big target to increase the number of data centers being built in those areas, that people are pushing back because they're seeing how much water these companies are planning to use, water that these communities often don't really have to give away to these major infrastructures in the first place. We have also seen a lot of protests around water and around data centers in different parts of the world. So these are signs from Chile and Uruguay, I believe. The top one here says, danger, no data center, data theft. So, you know, a sign really focusing on the data collection aspect of this. And then on the bottom, the sign that says, water is not given away, it is not sold, it is defended. You know, these people who are not okay with these data centers moving in and expecting to take so much water from their communities. But water is just one aspect of this, right? There's also the energy use that goes into powering these facilities. Again, there are tens of thousands of servers stuffed into one location. Often they'll build multiple locations alongside one another in these sites. So you can see that the kind of cost of this is really significant. And so globally, data centers account for about 2 to 3% of energy use. It's similar for emissions as well. In the United States, the emissions is about 5%. And the estimations that we have from the International Energy Agency is that in 2022, data centers, AI, and crypto globally accounted for 460 terawatt hours of energy use, so about the amount of France. And they predict that by 2026, that will increase to 1,050 terawatt hours, which is about the energy use of Japan. So again, this kind of significant increase in the amount of energy that is being used in just a few years in order to power these technologies. And you know, for that reason, a lot of people are not very happy about that when they move into their communities and start, you know, expecting to draw so much from the energy grid. So this is Eric Schmidt. He used to be CEO of Google. Now he's a big proponent of selling AI to militaries. He was recently in front of the Senate in the United States, and he said, many people project demand for our industry, meaning data centers, will go from 3% to 9% of total generation, and that was within a few years. You know, which is obviously a significant ramp up, right? Kind of tripling the amount of energy that they require, or the total generation that is happening, and as we know, energy generation continues to increase. And so he said, you know, following that a little bit later, we need more renewables, we also need more natural gas, we need more of everything. We're not going to be able to get the targets of gigawatts that we need without doing everything more. So he's saying, yeah, we can have this renewable energy, but we need to invest in a ton more fossil fuels as well, because this is what is going to be needed, especially in the short term, in order to power these infrastructures. And we're seeing these arguments from a lot of these tech industry folks these days as well. And we see the impact of that already in the United States, but many other parts of the world too. This is the data center that Elon Musk and XAI have built in Memphis, Tennessee, where they don't actually have the kind of energy that they need right now in order to power it. So they're using a ton of methane gas generators that they don't have the environmental permits to actually run. And so they are emitting you know, a lot of local air pollution. And this is in a traditionally black neighborhood in Memphis that has, has kind of felt the effects of environmental racism for generations and generations. And so Elon Musk and, this broader industry, his attempt to make his mark on the AI industry, is kind of perpetuating these cycles in the United States. And of course, this is just one example. We're seeing similar things around the world. One other place where we're seeing a lot of kind of gas generators being used to power data centers is Ireland, because Ireland is a site where there's a significant amount of data center construction that is ongoing, where people are increasingly fighting back against that, because 21% of all the electricity used in Ireland right now goes to data centers, and that is causing a lot of concern about grid capacity and reliability, particularly in the winter, where they have been experiencing more and more amber alerts, which basically means the grid operator says, we're reaching a point where, there's too much energy use and we're basically going to have blackouts if people don't start reducing their energy. And of course, the expectation then is for the public to reduce its energy use, not for the data centers to reduce their energy use. In Dublin, there has been a temporary moratorium on data center construction, which was actually put in by the grid because it couldn't handle more connections. And that's part of the reason why these data centers started relying more on gas generators and kind of bringing that in, which obviously has climate impacts as well, right? But beyond that, the increased demand that comes from all these new data centers that are being built also results in the construction of a lot more fossil fuels, or even keeping plants that were supposed to be decommissioned online for much longer. We saw this a few years ago when there was a lot of talk about how Bitcoin miners were keeping fossil fuel, whether it was coal or natural gas online, after it was supposed to be decommissioned, or even kind of resurrecting some plants. We're seeing that on a whole other scale with AI. So we see that coal plants are sticking around in the United States and other parts of the world in order to power AI, because you can kind of ramp that up in the really short term, rather than kind of building some new energy infrastructure that would take longer. We're also seeing kind of significant increases in natural gas investment in the United States right now, levels that they haven't seen in years, and a lot of that is going to power data centers, right? We're seeing this in other parts of the world as well. Of course, you will all be familiar with governments kind of rolling back some climate commitments and acknowledging that we need to be using more fossil fuels, or at least making the argument that we need to. And of course, part of that is because they feel that they need the energy in order to power data centers, AI, in order to kind of make their mark on this supposed industry of the future. Now, one of the things that the industry is doing to try to say that they are addressing these concerns is by saying that they're just going to invest in a lot of nuclear power, right? Because they position this as clean and green. People have different opinions on whether that is truthfully the case. I won't wade into those debates right now. But basically what we see is Microsoft resurrecting 3 Mile Island in the United States, which was the site of, a major nuclear disaster. Google is, of course, funding major new nuclear projects, or, at least companies that claim they're going to build them. We'll see what happens there. And that is the case with many of these tech companies that are claiming that they are making these investments in nuclear power, and that is going to mean that they are going to have all this energy to power AI into the future. But there are a lot of people who are calling this out as a form of greenwashing, because what we actually see in this moment is a massive increase in the use of fossil fuels in order to power AI. And we all know that nuclear power construction happens on very long time scales. And so even if they do end up relying on nuclear power, it's probably 10 or 15 years out when they need all that power today. And we know that that is not being done in a very clean and green ways, right? Beyond that too, there is a whole other dimension of this beyond just the immediate energy use of the data centers themselves and what is needed to power the technology. What we see is that Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Google has kind of rolled this back a little bit after criticism, but they are making deals with major oil and gas companies in order to basically deploy AI and build custom AI. It's Google that's not doing the custom part anymore, to be targeted toward oil and gas operations, with the goal of extracting more oil and gas more efficiently. And so, you know, kind of estimates that have been done and that Karen Howe mentions in this article that she put together, is that a single deal that Microsoft made with ExxonMobil in 2019 was estimated to expand oil production by as much as 50,000 oil equivalent barrels a day by 2025, this year of course, and that would produce an estimated 6.4 million metric tons of emissions based on that additional production, which completely negates the 2020 emissions pledge that Microsoft made and has not even held to. So this is also the impact of using these technologies to help increase oil and gas exploration production, you know, that isn't even included in the immediate energy use for, you know, the data centers themselves, for the technology itself, which, you know, is often not even included in the kind of, you know, calculations that these companies are putting together and not even sharing with us in many cases. So this guy, Sam Altman, you will be familiar with him probably. He's the CEO of OpenAI. Speaking last year to Bloomberg, he was kind of asked about the climate costs of this vision that he has for this world where generative AI tools and chatbots are going to be rolled out absolutely everywhere. And he was remarkably candid, I thought, actually. He said, "We do need way more energy in the world than I think we thought we needed before. We still don't appreciate the energy needs of this technology. I still expect, unfortunately, the world is on a path where we're going to have to do something dramatic with climate, like geoengineering, as a stopgap." What we're seeing from people like Sam Altman, from people like Bill Gates today, is this argument that in order to power these technologies, you know, without increasing emissions, without increasing fossil fuel production, we would need a breakthrough in nuclear energy or some other kind of nuclear energy technology, or sorry, some other energy technology that they admit is likely not on the horizon. And so in order to realize this world that they want to bring into being, you know, they're not going to question that, right? They're not going to question whether we should be, you know, putting all of these resources toward generative AI and whether it actually has the benefits that, you know, they want us to believe it has. Instead, they just say, well, if we can't do this breakthrough in energy technology that will allow us to do this without massively increasing emissions, then we'll just have to geoengineer the planet. Because there's no big risks in that, right? But I'm sure AI will allow us to do it very safely. I have no doubt. So what we're seeing more recently, you know, you might have seen these stories, what was this, early this year about DeepSeek, the Chinese competitor that does this so much more efficiently, right? The whole AI industry in America was so shocked that China could do technology, apparently. You know, we saw stocks plunge, you know, because people were so worried. You know, and there was all this discussion about how, you know, there's this more efficient model, there's this kind of question the foundations that this whole industry for the past 2 years have been built on. Is everything that they were doing completely out the window now? You know, are we going to have these AI technologies that are going to be so much more efficient? Well, they were very quick to assure us that will not be the case. You know, what we saw around the same time was Sam Altman, Oracle CEO, Larry Ellison, and SoftBank CEO Masayoshi Son appear with Donald Trump to announce the Stargate project, $500 billion investment to build out more AI infrastructure. Not to be outdone, of course, the EU jumped in with its own big commitment of its own. France as well, to make sure that they're not being left behind. Just this past week, we saw a commitment for a new Stargate facility in Abu Dhabi. So all of these countries competing to build out these massive AI infrastructures. And this is, of course, NVIDIA CEO here, and he says that basically the AI models like DeepSeek, if they are making things more efficient, that just means that more people are going to use these technologies, and so we're going to need 100 times more compute anyway. So everyone's still going to have to buy NVIDIA chips, don't worry. It's going to be great for his market share. You know, even beyond that, we're seeing these growing questions about the AI bubble, right? You know, investors who are questioning whether there's money really to be made here. You know, these increasing stories about Microsoft or Amazon pulling back on data center leases. In China, we're seeing questions as well about the AI bubble, about the data center build out over there, you know, whether this is all inflated and is going to collapse. You know, these questions have been, you know, being asked for a while. But what we do see as well is, you know, this, if it is a bubble, being maintained for some very specific reasons. And that is because AI has become, you know, a big piece of this increasing geopolitical game that is playing out, where the United States is going to different parts of the world and, basically claiming that AI is the future, that AI is very important, and if that countries want access to its chips and its AI technologies, that it needs to be in its kind of sphere and bubble. And, because all of these countries are rushing to get, their own AI capabilities, their own AI technologies, they don't want to, scare America away. Obviously, we have France, trying to position itself as the third pole of AI innovation between China and the United States, unleashing a lot of its own capital to try to build out its own AI companies. The UK, of course, under Keir Starmer, has just started doing whatever the tech companies want to try to make sure they're investing in the UK, rolling back copyright rules so that AI companies can train on whatever data they collect and have it considered fair use. Also ensuring that it's very easy for companies to build new data centers. They recently just overturned, the kind of rejection of a local community near London that didn't want a data center there, and the national government stepped in and said, nope, the data center is getting built, you can't stop it. And of course, we're seeing that around the UK because he wants to present the country as, being very friendly to the tech industry, because we know, of course, the UK is desperate for some investment after making the great decision to Brexit from the EU. Canada, my own country, of course, we have a new prime minister, and sadly he is repeating a lot of that language that we're hearing from Keir Starmer, saying that we need to reduce red tape on data center construction, saying that we need to roll out AI to make the public sector more efficient, so some scary things coming our way as well. And basically, generally what we're seeing beyond these leaders is a lot of countries trying to attract data center investment, trying to attract tech investment, trying to position themselves as being open to AI deployment and investment as well, because it's perceived to be, that is where economic growth is going. That is the next big thing. They don't want to miss out on this investment while there's so much of it flowing. And so that kind of gets me to some final questions, some sort of wrap-up things, right? So, basically the future as we see it right now is being led by, some very influential and powerful tech billionaires. Even though there are people pushing back against that, they are really the driving force here around the tech policy that we have, around the things that our governments are pursuing. But, ultimately, who should be deciding that, right? I think this is a question that we need to be asking ourselves. Should these tech billionaires really have the influence that they have over our governments, over the directions of our broader society, or should that be seized back so that it can be democratically decided, as the societies that we're apparently supposed to be living in are supposed to be democratic in that way? Beyond that, how much compute do we actually need? Do we actually need to be building out all these massive data centers to be powering generative AI technologies with questionable public benefit, just because these companies believe it is core to their future power, to the business models that they are pushing? How much would be necessary to build, technology that is beneficial to the public? Would it be the amount that we have today? I'm very skeptical. Beyond that, what do we do instead if we're thinking about this model being fundamentally broken, about thinking about these data centers and the AI build out that is happening and it not really serving the general public, but being for, these broader kind of fights among tech elites and political elites and all these sorts of things? Obviously there's one direction we could go that we saw in the 1970s, where people just started attacking computer centers in the middle of the Vietnam War. People who opposed the war and what the United States was doing in Vietnam targeted computer centers that were helping to plan where the bombs were going to be dropped and how the campaign was going to be, undertaken. And so, we actually saw, these computer centers being blown up. Maybe, hopefully, we don't need to get to that point and we can rein things in before that, but maybe that's where it goes if, they won't listen to people, right? And so I kind of see this in two different ways, right? On the one hand, if we're thinking about what an alternative is to use regulation to try to rein in the companies that already exist, but also to think beyond that, right? What is something else? How can technology be used in a different way? I don't need to tell you, of course, that the European Union has been one of the leaders on tech regulation around the world. There are questions as to whether those are the right approaches to be taking, which I think are legitimate questions to be asking. But the goal here needs to be to kind of constrain these American tech companies that have so dominated the digital environment in so many of our countries for such a long time. But then there's a need to think beyond that, right? Okay, so you're going to constrain these companies that already exist, you know, whether it's through making them pay higher taxes, putting regulations on data collection and transmission and use, you know, legislating labor protections for the types of workers working in these industries. Think about the gig economy and the ongoing kind of, you know, difficulties in guaranteeing the rights of those sorts of workers. But what comes beyond that, right, when you start to rein this in? And, you know, there's a recent report called the Eurostack report. Maybe some of you have heard of it. I don't agree with everything in there, but I think that that they have some good diagrams that kind of lay out the different, you know, kind of technologies that our societies rely on, also showing us, you know, the types of, the parts of the world that are kind of leading in the creation of those. Obviously, we see that the United States and China are often the ones that are dominant in those areas. And, you know, so thinking about what it would take to actually build up more of these capacities in other parts of the world, but also to share these learnings, you know, these teachings, these capacities, so that it's not just like, you know, we're all trying to compete to develop this stuff on our own, and to see how we can roll it out for commercial purposes. And, you know, there are thinking around what this could potentially look like, right? You know, there are aspects of this that look at state-led investment to help to develop an alternative tech infrastructure, right? You know, there's all of these resources in these major tech companies right now that we're seeing deployed to build out these major data centers, to develop these AI tools that, you know, have questionable benefit. How do we kind of, you know, have the resources to do something different, to think about something different? You know, often it is government, it is the state that has those resources that would need to be deployed to do something like that. Part of what I was arguing in a recent report called Reclaiming Digital Sovereignty that I co-authored with some colleagues late last year to try to make sure that we had a more critical perspective in these discussions as they were taking root, taking shape. You know, beyond that, thinking about how technology can be kind of reconceived, right? Right now it's something that is developed by these major companies, often that is rolled out to the public, and we are just subject to, you know, these platforms and these decisions that they have made. But how can we bring that down to communities, actually make sure that there's resources to develop technology that serves the public, that responds to the needs of different, you know, people in our societies? That's kind of something that Dan Hind was writing about in the British Digital Cooperative Report, where he was looking at, like, you know, we have this, you know, public media institution, public broadcaster. How can we think about updating something like that for the 21st century, you know, to use technology to actually benefit the broader public, and to make sure that we have public technology development that is non-market, that is, you know, working for people rather than for shareholders. But also thinking about what it looks like to develop an international alliance, to pool these resources, right? Part of the reason the United States has been able to dominate is because it has so much capital within the United States, because there's so much capacity there, because the internet kind of rolled out from there, and then its companies kind of followed that rollout and dominated these various markets, right? So instead of, you know, Europe or different countries in Europe working on their own, instead of Canada working on its own, instead of Brazil working on its own, how can there be collaboration to share these technologies, to share these developments, you know, so that people are actually working together for, you know, the common purpose? And, you know, as I said before, ultimately that's about thinking about how technology is developed and deployed for the public good, rather than to have a really big IPO when the company goes public to maximize shareholder value so investors can make a lot of money. That is guiding a lot of these discussions around digital sovereignty today in Europe and other parts of the world. And obviously that's not going to result in much good for many people, I don't think. So thank you so much. Hopefully this helped to fill you in a bit more on sustainable AI. And yeah, thank you.
Again, we have 5 minutes for Q&A before we move into the panel.
First, thank you very much for the presentation. It was great. So my question is maybe kind of obvious or whatever. How do you deal with somebody who, or like how do you approach like talking about something like this with somebody who just like doesn't believe climate change is real? Or just like somebody who's just like, I mean, the US is very divided now, and I struggle with, you know, people in my family, you know, with this type of topic because they just don't believe in it.
Right. Well, that becomes difficult because there's so many other things you kind of need to address before the AI question, it feels like, right? Maybe I should get closer to the mic here. I think for me, it really depends on the context and the particular person, and I think anyone would know the person better than I would who they're talking to, right? And so I would hope then that they would know the types of things that would resonate with that person. So, is it thinking about data collection or all of this kind of stuff that is going to matter to them? Is it about thinking about the potential impacts in their local community? Are they concerned about the type of information that they're consuming online and whether they're worried about increasing kind of AI generated information being something that is untrustworthy? I talk to a lot of people who are like, I saw this thing online, I don't know if it was real because I don't know if it was made by an AI or if it was like, a fact-based thing, right? I think that this is like an increasing part of the conversation for people who can't easily pick this out. So, yeah, I would say it's a difficult one, and I think part of what I find like hopeful in some of the data center organizing is it takes it away from some of these like more abstract issues, because when you have one of these facilities being built in your region, where it becomes very tangible to you to see what this infrastructure is and, what is the result of this technology or what is needed to power it, then you can have discussions that are, much more based on something concrete rather than like, do you believe in climate change? Or like, but instead it's like, do you see how much energy that's using up? Like, from the local grid, do you see what kind of effects that's having? Do you see how much it's like draining the local water that we rely on? It allows these discussions to be much more tangible, which is maybe an in rather than being like, hey, how the planet's heating up, but you don't believe in that anyway. Well, this is a problem, right? Like, I think that there are many, basically what I'm trying to say is I think that there are many issues related to AI data centers, the technological infrastructure that we've built up that can potentially be pulled from if climate change is not the one that is going to motivate the type of person that you're talking to. Does that make sense?
Cool. I'm wondering if we can tap into the rage that people are starting to feel about these billionaires, stealing all this stuff and capitalizing on what they, and so my question is basically, do you still see a possibility of going back to the first big crime of big tech in terms of, or one of the big ones, of stealing all of our data to then use it for the new rollout of whatever they're going to capitalize with all of that data that they took from us? And just to give an example of like just the other day, like a artist like Elton John is in the headlines to say like, fuck no, I don't want these people to be able to, steal my life's work. Yeah. And I think that that's something that could resonate with everyone, to say, no, you can't have all of this data. We're going back to, I don't know, create some new regulation in terms of like how all of this data, collected data, can be used, or how can we get it back, Yep. Your comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's opportunities there, right? I think in general, people have become somewhat used to the expectation that these companies are taking all of this data on us, and that has become like, kind of an expectation of the modern digital environment. But I would say a lot of people are still not very comfortable with that fact, right? And I feel like the AI moment the generative AI moment specifically, has put a number of things into context and has allowed us to really like focus in on some specific problems with this, digital technological system that we have built up over these past few decades that, is very dependent on a few really large companies, right? And so, whenever I talk about digital sovereignty, one of the things that I talk about very specifically is whether we actually need to have this degree of data collection, whether we can think of developing technology in a very different way that has a lot of restrictions on data collection, data use, data transfer, because that is so core to the business models of so many of these major companies. So if you're looking to kind of rein in the power that they have, targeting data is a really good, opportunity for that, I think, right? And I think the other piece of it is that, when we look at these AI models, when you look at the amount of data that they've collected, there's the piece of it on, journalism and books and art and stuff that gets people activated, the fact that they've taken music and movies and those sorts of things. But also there's the aspect of it as well that I feel like is less talked about, where they have also scraped a lot of social media platforms, like a lot of the personal data that people have contributed. And I feel like that's not talked about enough, but when I've talked about it to people, they have been surprised and angry to learn that, right? So yeah, just to say, I think that there's opportunity there, and I think that that should very much like be in our crosshairs as something that we're trying to achieve, right? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so I hear about all of this ecosystem around AI, which is like the big tech companies, politics, shareholders, the way the economy works, and it just begins to become like this delusional narrative that it's just like everyone is crazy, like what you talked about, like making these data centers and blah, blah, blah. We don't even know why. And it makes me think like, okay, it feels disconnected to reality. How can we ground? First, how do we identify all of these crazy narratives and just, like point them as crazy? And how do we ground it to everybody? Because this includes everybody, as we are saying, or we're talking about. They are using our data, and yeah, how do we ground this better and put it more into regulation and that actually makes sense?
I feel like we're kind of dealing with two different narratives of AI right now, right? One where it is so powerful and going to transform the world in so many ways, and all of these countries are desperate to get their little piece of it, right? And so there's this big like kind of geopolitical fight. There's all of this money being splashed out to try to attract AI investment, to try to get data centers built and all this kind of stuff. And then on the other piece, there's this narrative where Microsoft and Amazon are pulling back on data center leases, where the data center boom in China has basically stalled, and a lot of data centers have kind of gone bust because they overbuilt. Where we have increasing stories about, and I hate this term, but the amount of hallucinations in the AI models. Yeah, I think it's a very deceptive term, a misleading term, but that's what we use because that's the common term. That actually the amount of hallucinations in the models is getting worse, not better, despite what they told us. That there are growing questions about how these AI tools are being used, about the actual benefit of it. Obviously, the continued questions about the cost of building all this out and whether there's actually like a market case for all of this. So yeah, I think that we're dealing with these two narratives, and for me, the kind of thing I've been grappling with lately is, I think if it had not become this geopolitical tool, this kind of geopolitical ball that everyone's fighting over, that the bubble would have already burst by now. But because Trump was elected, and because he was so close to the tech industry, and because this was kind of like renewed as a piece of like the global geopolitical fight, then they have been able to get this whole kind of new wave of funding and interest, regardless of whether the technology justifies it. And yeah, so I'm at a moment where like I'm still trying to figure out what happens with it next. Can the bubble still burst even with all this money kind of coming into it? Yeah, so I don't know. I don't think that really answers your question, but that's kind of like where my thinking is on it right now. Yeah, I don't know. I do, because I think it's kind of inevitable, because I think that that's the way that this industry has built itself, right? I think Silicon Valley, modern Silicon Valley, kind of post-privatization of the internet Silicon Valley is a very financialized industry, and the model of tech development that they have created is a very financialized one that is based on not so much, like if you build the monopoly, you're going to make monopoly profits, but a lot of the kind of, model of startup growth and creation is like, we're going to lose a lot of money and hopefully investors will make it back when the company IPOs. And we need to kind of get people excited and hype people up about this next wave or whatever it is that we're talking about now, the Internet of Things, self-driving cars, crypto, metaverse. There's a whole wave of different things that have their moment where they go up and then they collapse back down again. And going back to the dot-com boom and bust, this is what this industry has been doing for the past few decades. And so it seems inevitable that the AI bubble will burst as well. It's just, how does that happen? When does it happen? That is kind of the thinking there, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much for now.
Of course, thanks.